The Slaughter Beneath the Cypress. In the forgotten crook of 1854 Louisiana, beneath cypress branches, draped in Spanish moss and skies that never quite cleared, there lay a place so remote even the riverboats turned away. They called it Cypress Hollow, a town not marked on maps, yet carved deep into the memory of anyone who ever tasted its meat. A place where prayers hung limp in the sweltering air, and kindness came smoked, salted, and wrapped in silence. There were no roads that led directly to Cypress Hollow. The only path was a mud-slick trail that twisted through the swamp like a vein, pulsing with decay and secrets. The town itself was barely more than a whisper. 27 clapboard homes, a church with stained glass so old the saints had no eyes, and a post office where letters went in but rarely came back out. The days there moved slowly, like molasses sliding off a blade, and the nights were thick with the smell of burning wood and something else, something you didn't name if you wanted to sleep through till morning. At the edge of this withering community stood a cottage wrapped in ivy and fog, and behind it, a structure that never seemed to stop breathing. Locals called it the smokehouse, though it might as well have been a mouth, always exhaling, always hungry. This was the domain of Ole and Mabel Tobido, two sisters born of swamp water and silence, raised in the art of making things last. Their cottage was pristine, out of place in a town that reeked of mildew and desperation. Lace curtains fluttered in its windows. A piano sat in the parlor, just one key short of whole. And a grandfather clock ticked steadily, always 3 minutes slow, as though time itself hesitated to move forward under their roof. Ole was the older, sharp-eyed, polished, a lady in every sense of the word. Her gloves were always clean, though her work was anything but. Mabel was softer, quieter, with a ribbon always tied in her hair, and red beneath her fingernails that never quite scrubbed clean. Together, they ran the smokehouse. Together, they fed the town. And Cypress Hollow, hungry, ragged Cypress Hollow, loved them for it. They fed the village through famine and flood. When hogs died of fever, the Tobido sisters brought smoked brisket. When a storm tore down cabins, they arrived with stew and dumplings soft enough to make grown men weep. And when the winter of '53 turned the forest silent, when every trap came up empty and deer vanished like ghosts, it was the sisters who kept plates full and stomachs warm. No one asked too many questions. They said the meat came from a cousin up north, a trapper who sent salted cuts by the barrel. Others believed they raised feral hogs deep in the swamp, where no man dared go if you wondered. But wondering in a place like Cypress Hollow was a dangerous kind of hunger. And hunger, real hunger, eats curiosity whole. The smokehouse itself was a squat, slanted building with walls blackened by years of burning, and a chimney that choked on its own soot. Its doors were thick, iron-hinged, and chained shut with a padlock that looked more like a shackle. On smoke days, the chimney would erupt, and the scent, God, the scent, would drift through the trees like an offering. Garlic, peppercorn, oak, and beneath it all, a whisper of iron. Faint, metallic. Most ignored it, most. Except for one man. Father Henry arrived in spring. Young, earnest, and ill-equipped, sent by the diocese in Baton Rouge to restore faith in a town that had long since learned to rely on flesh rather than the word. He was met with polite nods and warm plates. But as weeks passed, his eyes lingered longer on the smokehouse, on the women who smiled too easily, on the empty chairs that once belonged to travelers who'd passed through and never returned. The townsfolk, they didn't seem to mind. A merchant from New Orleans, a trapper from Arkansas, a mute boy seeking work, gone. Just gone. And no one mourned. They simply nodded, chewed, and gave thanks for the ribs served hot at Sunday picnics. Father Henry began to notice things. The Tobido sisters never bought livestock, never haggled at the market, never once traded coin for meat. And yet, Their smokehouse smoked day after day, as if fed by something that never ran out. Old man Broussard, the wheelwright, said it best in a mutter over a rusted nail. "They always eat." He spat into the dirt and went back to hammering, as if that said enough. Inside the cottage, things were no less unsettling. No men ever visited. No deliveries. No animals seen or heard. And yet, every week, Yulie walked through the village in her pressed skirts, her dark gloves immaculate, delivering linen-wrapped bundles that smelled of heaven and hell in equal measure. The town called them saints. Some whispered the word, angels. But Father Henry began to wonder if it wasn't something else entirely. Because beneath kindness, there is often calculation. Beneath warmth, there can be rot. And behind the smokehouse, far from prying eyes, something waited. Children had long whispered about Mabel, calling her the quiet butcher. Her apron was always stained, her gaze always distant. And when she stirred the fires behind the cottage, smoke curled out like fingers searching for something to pull in. The children would dare each other to touch the smokehouse wall and run. None ever stayed long enough to hear what it whispered back. Then came the journal, hidden beneath a floorboard in the church, perhaps left behind by the priest before Henry. Father Henry found it while cleaning out the baptismal records. A red leather-bound ledger, brittle with age. Inside, names written in chalk the color of dried blood. Names he recognized. Travelers, drifters, even a woman pregnant with twins. Each name followed by notes: tender thigh, young clean, little waist. A slow dread grew in him, the kind that does not scream, but rots. He began to keep watch. He saw what others would not. And when a trader named Elijah Cole passed through town, he tried to intervene. Warned him not to stay with the sisters. "Don't eat their food," Henry said. Elijah laughed in his face. That was the last time anyone saw Elijah Cole. His horse stood tethered the next morning, his cart untouched, his boots, polished and sturdy, still sitting beside the Tobito cottage. And that night, the smoke rose darker than ever before. Henry gagged at the scent. He prayed, clutching his rosary, like it might anchor him to something righteous. But no amount of prayer could mask the sweetness that lingered in the air, the perfume of roasted flesh and unspoken sins. The next day, Yulie brought a tray to the church. Honeyed meat slices wrapped in white parchment. "For the congregation," she said, smiling like nothing had been lost. Henry took it, hands shaking. That night, he buried the tray beneath the rose bushes behind the rectory. He could not serve it, could not burn it, could not name it. And then came the child, Jack Lauro, 10 years old, sharp eyes, dirty knees, a boy born into a town that had long since bartered its soul. He watched the smokehouse with curiosity that had not yet been bled dry. He saw what others didn't. No animals, no deliveries, just smoke, always smoke. So, one Sunday afternoon, while his father napped drunk and the town rested in heat and hunger, Jack slipped through the trees and crouched behind the smokehouse. There was a seam between the boards, warped from years of fire. He pressed his face to it, breath held. Inside, the smoke coiled like a living thing. And then it parted. Just enough. He didn't see a pig. He saw a man. Naked, upside down, suspended by a hook driven through the heel. His back was flayed in ribbons. Steam rose from his flesh. Blood dripped in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Jack did not scream. He backed away on trembling legs, eyes wide, mouth open, unable to make a sound. Because some truths do not shatter. They slice. They sear. And Cypress Hollow was about to choke on its own silence. The hospital that took no patients. Jack Lauro did not speak for 3 days after what he saw behind the smokehouse. Not a word passed his lips. Not during supper, when his mother pressed meat into his trembling hands. Not when his father, confused by the silence, struck him with the flat of his palm and demanded he be a man. And not that night when he slipped from his bed and quietly vomited everything he had eaten for the last 2 days beneath the porch. Even then, he was silent. But silence in Cypress Hollow was never empty. It was heavy. Watching. The kind of silence that filled the lungs and refused to leave. Father Henry noticed. He watched the boy from the chapel steps, arms folded, eyes narrowed with suspicion that had grown louder with every Sunday roast and every vanished traveler. He asked Jack's mother if he was sick. "Just a phase," she said, brushing flour off her apron. "He'll get over it." Henry doubted that. He'd seen the look in the boy's eyes before, on men back from war, or priests who'd read too far into forbidden texts. Something inside Jack had broken. By the 5th day, the boy spoke. Just once. A single sentence whispered into Henry's ear during confession. A sentence that would change everything. "They're feeding us people." That night, Henry didn't sleep. He paced the small rectory with the boy's words gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He thought of the journal beneath his bed. He thought of the names, the descriptions, the eerie precision. Thick around the midsection. Too lean. Missing a finger. Cut that side first. The next morning, Henry visited the only man in town who might believe him. Wade Harker. Wade was a carpenter who hadn't entered the chapel in 10 years, ever since his wife died in childbirth, and he'd buried her with his own hands behind their cabin. But Wade knew things. He drank too much and spoke too little, and no one questioned how he always had meat despite never hunting. They said he was crazy, but he wasn't. Just tired. And tired men are dangerous when cornered. Henry brought him the journal. Wade read it silently, jaw tightening with each page. When he finished, he didn't say a word. He simply nodded once, slow and deliberate, and stood up. From the corner, he pulled a rusted axe. He didn't smile. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "We end this now." But Cypress Hollow was a place that protected its own evil. By the time the two men reached the smokehouse, it was already smoking. Thick, black clouds billowed from the chimney. The iron doors were chained shut, but fresh footprints, bare and small, were stamped in the mud. Someone had gone inside. "Jack," Henry said, voice hollow. No, they broke the lock. The chains hit the ground with a sound like a scream, and the door swung inward. The smoke was blinding, wet and hot like breath. Inside, the air stank of burning fat and cloves. The boy was there, unconscious, collapsed near the pit. The body he had seen earlier was gone. Only bones remained, blackened and brittle, cracked open like crab legs to scoop out the marrow. Henry carried Jack out while Wade looked around. On the far wall, he found hooks, 7 of them, still stained. But above the pit, something worse. A grate covered in hardened tallow, where cuts of meat had been laid to smoke. The ceiling above it was slick with years of drippings. This was no ordinary slaughterhouse. It was a shrine, a machine, an altar built for unholy preservation. And then they heard the laughter. Light, feminine, almost playful. Ulay Tobito stood just beyond the smoke, dress untouched by the soot that clung to everything else. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. Her voice was kind, as if scolding a child who'd snuck a second helping of pie. "This isn't for you." Wade didn't answer. He raised his axe. But by the time he stepped forward, Mabel appeared behind him. Quiet, barefoot, and fast. She brought the butcher's cleaver down into the back of his shoulder before he could turn. Bone split. Wade screamed. Henry dropped the boy and lunged, but Mabel was already on him. Fingers dug deep into his face. She fought like something that had never been taught to feel pain. Like a thing that had only ever known survival. Ulay didn't move. She just watched. That was the first moment Henry understood something dark and undeniable. They didn't kill because they had to. They killed because it gave them power. But the sisters had underestimated desperation. Wade, bleeding and half-blind, rammed his shoulder into Mabel, sending her sprawling. Henry pulled Jack and ran. Not toward the town, but into the swamp. The vines clawed at them. The water sucked at their ankles. But they ran. All night. Until they found a hunter's shack long abandoned. There, in the damp shadows, Henry finally spoke the truth aloud. "It's not just murder," he whispered. "It's preservation. Ritual. Something ancient." He remembered passages from scripture long removed from public reading. He recalled apocryphal texts, ones that spoke of smoke spirits, beings who survived off offerings of charred flesh. They were not gods, not demons. Something older. Something that existed in smoke itself, that took form when enough meat was burned, enough blood spilled. Could that be what the sisters were feeding? Could Cypress Hollow be their temple? He didn't know. But he knew this. The town would never believe him. So the next day, he returned. Alone, with Wade too injured to walk and Jack asleep beneath blankets. Henry re-entered Cypress Hollow to confront the devil in her Sunday dress. But the smokehouse was gone. Not destroyed. Not abandoned. Gone. In its place, a clearing of scorched earth and footprints that circled endlessly like dancers. The cottage still stood. The curtains still swayed. But the chimney was sealed. The smoke was gone. The sisters, too, were gone. Vanished into legend. Henry stayed for 2 more days. He tried to warn the villagers. He brought the journal. He told them what he'd seen. Some laughed. Some grew silent. Most simply nodded and walked away. A few offered him pie. He left Cypress Hollow in silence. That night, the town feasted again. And in the distance, beneath the hollow moon, the scent of smoked meat returned to the air. The recipe of silence. The first time Amelia Morant ever heard the phrase, tallow tongue. She was barely 12 years old and hiding beneath the butcher's counter in Revel Market. She had stolen a jar of honeyed figs and was waiting for the old man behind the stall to finish his smoke so she could slip out unnoticed. But the 2 women in line ahead of him caught her attention. Their voices were low, like gossip passed at a wake. "You can tell by the way they talk," one said. "Slippery, like their tongues made of tallow." The other woman nodded, her eyes darting left and right. "Means they fed on long pig. That smoke stays inside you. Changes the way you move. Changes the way you taste." Amelia didn't understand half of what they said. But she never forgot the phrase. Tallow tongue. It haunted her, even into adulthood, when she took a job with the Louisiana Historical Health Survey. The job was simple. Find old hospitals. Record what was left. Map the decay. She didn't expect to find Riverside Sanatorium. It wasn't on any map. The building had no address, no roads leading to it, and the coordinates she followed came from a handwritten note pinned between 2 pages of a tuberculosis registry from 1854. A scribble, no signature. Just, they kept them in the smoke. What they were was never explained. Amelia found the place by accident. Not by looking, but by listening. Locals in the area, when asked about Riverside, would stiffen and glance toward the trees. No one gave directions, but they all said the same thing. You'll know it by the smell. So she followed the scent. Not rot, not mildew. Smoke, faint, sweet, like cherry bark and old blood. The sanatorium appeared like a blister in the landscape, sunken into the swamp, but still standing. It shouldn't have been there. The bricks were too clean, the windows too clear, like it had simply paused in time. There were no birds, No insects. Just trees leaning inward like they were trying to listen. The inside was worse. Every corridor looked identical. Peeling walls, white tile with black veins running through them like mold trapped beneath a frozen lake. Each room contained a bed. Each bed had straps. And above each bed, a thin copper pipe descending from the ceiling, its end scorched black. She counted 33 rooms before she realized what they were. Smoke chambers. They had smoked the patients. Not to kill them, not right away. To cure them, maybe. Or preserve. Or prepare. The old reports she'd read on tuberculosis treatment had mentioned heat therapy, but this wasn't that. The residue in the pipes, the scoring on the tiles, this wasn't about health. This was about sacrifice. In the operating theater, she found a ledger. Not a medical book. A recipe book. Handwritten in a woman's elegant scrawl. The same hand that had written the note in the TB registry. She read, infant marrow must be rendered slowly, 2 to 3 hours. Mix with ash from elderbark for oil of memory. Adult thigh yields the best muscle. Salt first, then smoke. Eyes must be eaten fresh. They see the smoke best when new. She dropped the book. The next pages were drawings, crude diagrams of human bodies with parts circled, labeled not with medical terms, but with names like silence, pain, fat, joy, marrow. It was a cookbook for souls. The last page simply read, when enough smoke is made, she will walk again. Amelia turned and ran, but the hallway had changed. Every door was open now. Not ajar. Not cracked. Open. The rooms no longer looked empty. They breathed. From the shadows, thin voices whispered her name. She had never given her name aloud, not to anyone, but they knew. The voices smelled like the market stalls she'd hidden behind as a child. Burnt figures rendered lard. Hair. She stumbled back, clutching the recipe book to her chest like a shield. That's when she saw them. 2 figures at the end of the hall. Sisters, maybe. One tall, one smaller. Both pale. Their dresses were spotless, as if steam pressed just seconds ago. Their eyes were not eyes. Just ash. Thick and still smoking. Oulé and Mabel. But that wasn't possible. They had died nearly 2 centuries ago. Unless... The book trembled in her hands. Smoke was memory. That's what the entries had meant. Smoke didn't kill. It preserved. It fed on the pain, the process, the slow breaking of flesh. It kept those who participated alive in the memory of the act itself. They weren't alive in the traditional sense. They were something else. Tallow-tongued ghosts. And now she had read the recipe. The sisters smiled. Amelia screamed. And just like that, she was outside. Blinking. The building was gone. No swamp. No walls. Just a collapsed foundation and a half-rotted signpost. Riverside Sanatorium, 1853. Had she imagined it? In her hands, the recipe book remained, smoldering at the edges. She didn't return to her office. She drove west, fast, not stopping until she was across the state line. She checked into a motel and spent the next 2 days copying the journal. Every line, every diagram. She emailed it to a dozen people, just in case. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She went to church. The priest, Father Renard, listened to her story in full. When she finished, he didn't laugh. He didn't speak. He stood, walked to the back, and returned with a book older than the pews themselves. He opened it. She saw pages of smoke rituals, diagrams of burning lungs, a creature called the Lady of Breathless Rooms. A spirit that feeds on air thickened with human death. Renard turned the page. There, scrawled in the margins in red ink, was a sentence she had heard before, in a child's whisper, echoing in her dreams since that day at the market. She walks again when the smoke remembers her. Amelia left the church with the journal and the warning. That night, the motel burned down. She survived. Barely. They never found the cause. Witnesses said the smoke smelled sweet. The lady of breathless rooms. When the firefighters pulled Amelia Morant from the wreckage, her mouth was full of soot, but her lungs were clean. Too clean. The attending EMT said it like a joke, but the expression on his face said otherwise. He'd seen plenty of smoke inhalation victims. None came out without black mucus, singed nasal hairs, blistered throats. But Amelia's throat looked untouched. Pink. Pristine. It was as if the smoke had entered her, and then changed its mind. 3 people died in the motel fire, all of them in the rooms adjacent to hers. But room 6, Amelia's room, looked untouched, except for one detail. The mirror above the desk had shattered inward. Not from the heat. Not from impact. Something had come through. They took her to a hospital in Beaumont. She didn't speak for 3 days. Just stared at the blank ceiling and waited for the smoke to come back. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. The recipe book, now cinched around the edges, never left her hands. On the 4th day, she spoke to a nurse. One sentence. "Has anyone smelled figs?" The nurse blinked, confused. "No, ma'am." But that wasn't true. The hallway outside her room was full of it. A warm, syrupy scent of cooked fruit, cinnamon, and something acrid buried just beneath the sweetness. Like meat. Old meat. She discharged herself that night and drove north, gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned bloodless. With every mile she put between herself and the ruins of Riverside, the air seemed to lose its weight. But the smell lingered. Not on her. Not on her clothes. Inside her. She had inhaled the recipe. The next person she visited was not a priest or a historian, but a folklorist named Simon Verleau. He taught at a small college in Alexandria, Louisiana, and specialized in pre-Civil War oral traditions. But more importantly, he'd published an obscure paper on airbound entities in rural Southern folklore, spirits that lived in breath, in smoke, in ash, in the silence between exhales. Verleau didn't ask her to explain. He opened the door with a blank stare and said, "You've seen her, haven't you?" Amelia nodded. "She came to my grandfather too," he whispered. Before he died, he said he could smell his own lungs cooking. Verleau lit a cigarette and began to explain. Slowly, carefully, like each word had weight. They called her La Dame Sans Souffle, the lady without breath. She doesn't kill you the way a demon or ghost does. She cooks you, inside out, a slow rendering of memory. She feeds on recollection, not just yours, but the memory of what happened to others. She's a kind of god, older than Christianity, older than even the tribes who first lived along the Mississippi. She is smoke that remembers. Amelia opened the recipe book and showed him the page with the phrase, "She walks again when the smoke remembers her." Verleau pointed to a symbol beneath it, a circle bisected with a jagged line, like a split lung. That's her sigil. It's appeared in slave carvings, in settler journals, even in early French missionary texts. And always, always near places of great sickness. Sanatoria, lazarettos, plague houses, wherever the line between death and breath grew thin. Amelia leaned forward. But the sisters, Ulay and Mabel, they were real. They made this. Verleau nodded. They didn't make it. They found it, and they used it. Over and over again. He unrolled an old map of Louisiana, dated 1854, and pointed to 5 marked locations. None of them were on any modern map, all in swamp country, all marked with the same lung symbol. All 5 sites burned within a year of opening, he said, and all 5 had reports of patients going missing, unregistered cremations, a smell of sweet smoke in the air, and 2 names always attached, U. Morant and M. Morant, sisters, cannibals, worshippers of the breathless one. Verlot turned to a glass case behind his desk and removed a small, soot-blackened jar. Inside it, something yellow and gelatinous, like old fat. When he opened it, the room filled instantly with a scent of scorched figs. Amelia recoiled. "What is that?" "Rendered joy marrow," he said flatly. "Taken from a preserved body found buried under an old church floorboard. One of their victims. I've kept it sealed for 20 years. But the smell never fades. That's how she stays alive. The lady of breathless rooms. She needs witnesses. She needs smell. She needs someone to remember." Amelia shook her head. "Why me?" Verlot lit another cigarette, his hands trembling. "Because you opened the book. And more than that, because you survived the fire." Then he leaned in close. "You've been breathing her now. Your body isn't yours anymore. Not completely. You've got enough smoke in you to call her down." Amelia left before nightfall. But Verlot was right. That night, she dreamt of the sanatorium again. But this time, it wasn't abandoned. It was alive. Every bed was filled. Every pipe dripping smoke. The walls pulsed with breath, and in the center hallway, the sisters stood, hands clasped, eyes wide, singing in a voice not meant for human throats. Behind them loomed a third figure. She had no face, only smoke. Her breath rattled like dry leaves. Her hands were mouths. Her ribs were gills. She saw Amelia. And she smiled. Amelia woke screaming. But she was not in her bed. She was standing in a hallway she didn't recognize, barefoot, in her nightgown, soot on her arms and throat. It was a hospital. Not one she'd seen before. No lights. No signs. The walls were tiled, and above each bed, a pipe. One of them dripped. Drip, drip, drip. Smoke poured into the room, slow and syrupy. A figure writhed in the bed, strapped down, eyes rolled back. A mirror on the opposite wall reflected Amelia's face, but her eyes weren't hers. They were full of ash. She woke again, this time for real, sobbing and retching black mucus. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She returned to Riverside, or what was left of it. The ground still smoldered in places, though the fire had long since died. The structure had collapsed into a shell of brick and iron, but something still remained beneath. The basement. She remembered the trapdoor beneath the operating theater. It had been locked before, but now it hung open like a mouth. She climbed down into the dark. Each step creaked with memory. The air grew warmer. Below, she found the kiln. It was vast, bigger than it had any right to be, a circular chamber lined with brick and bone. Hooks still hung from the ceiling. The center was filled with ash. But the walls, those were the worst. They pulsed, not metaphorically, literally, breathing. With every exhale, the chamber let out a moan, like wind across a grave. Amelia stepped forward, the book in one hand, a lighter in the other. She would end it here. Burn the book. Burn the smoke. But then the voices returned. They weren't angry. They were mournful. Children, old women, men begging for air. Their voices wrapped around her, sobbing through soot. Don't forget us. She needs the memory. If you forget, she grows hungry, and hunger makes her move. Then, behind her, footsteps. Not Olay. Not Mabel. The lady herself. No breath, no shape. Just heat and the rattle of bone-dry lungs. She was not walking. She was exhaling forward like a fog made of centuries. Amelia struck the lighter. Flame. She looked down at the book, but something in her froze. If she destroyed it, the voices said she wouldn't be killing her. She would be starving her. And when she starved, she left the walls. Amelia stood there, shaking, and for the first time realized this wasn't a choice about good or evil. This was about containment, about remembering what had happened over and over, so it stayed there in the smoke instead of out here. The book was a prison, and she was its new warden. When she walked out of Riverside, the sun was rising. She drove east, then further 100 miles, 200, until she reached the Atlantic. She opened a safe deposit box under a false name and placed the book inside, along with a vial of ash and a copy of Verlot's notes. She mailed one key to Father Renard, another to Simon Verlot, and then she disappeared. You can't find Amelia Morant anymore. But if you smell something sweet in a place that should be cold, if your dreams fill with the sound of smoke, if you wake up coughing soot into your hands, it means the book has been opened again. And she is exhaling. Somewhere, where the gulls don't cry, on the far edge of the Louisiana coastline, past the marshes where even the oil rigs dare not drill, there's a town called St. Regine. You won't find it on maps. The road that leads there is unpaved and unofficial, swallowed yearly by tide and moss. It used to be a port, a shrimping village with a steeple so rusted it gleamed red at dusk. But now, it's more memory than place. Wind-worn signs. Houses slumped like drunks. Not a single gull in the air. The air here smells of iron and fermenting salt. And for 50 years, no one who's ever left St. Regine has come back. I followed Amelia Morant's trail here because of what was found in the town's old parish records. An unregistered crematory, buried beneath a church that no longer officially exists. A final destination for those who could not die properly, as one ledger described it. Even more troubling, 5 victims from the original Riverside sanatorium fire were listed under that same registry. But that fire happened 2 parishes away. Those bodies should never have been moved. And yet, here they were, transferred, burned, erased. The church itself was called Église des Derniers Soupers, the Church of Last Breaths. Locals, what few remain, call it the Still House. I arrived just after sunset. My rental car barely made it past the gravel pits, and the radio gave out 2 miles before the edge of town. No signal, no GPS, just the growing sense that time here was slowed, like everything was breathing slower than it should. There were no birds, no insects, and the smoke was already in the air. Not thick, not visible, but sweet, the way figs rot in summer, the way a funeral smells the moment before someone cries. The church stands at the highest point in St. Regine. Its steeple leans, and the stained glass is all gone, but the bones of it remain. Black mold climbs the outer walls like ivy. I approached the front steps and found them covered in small, hand-drawn sigils. Not graffiti. Words. Someone had tried to keep something in. Inside, the pews were gone. Only the altar remained, broken in half like a snapped spine. The floor creaked underfoot, and somewhere far below it, I heard it, dripping. Smoke, not water. I found the hatch behind the pulpit. Chained shut, but the lock had long since rusted. I broke it with a crowbar and descended slowly, flashlight in one hand, recorder in the other. The stairs were narrow, cut from stone. The walls were slick with condensation, and each step carried me deeper into a furnace that shouldn't be burning. Beneath the church was the crematory, yes, but not like any I'd ever seen. It was ritualistic. A domed chamber lined with clay tiles, all scorched black. 4 stone tables sat around a central kiln, not metal ovens. Stone slabs with carved gutters and chains. This was no government-approved crematorium. This was a place of offering. Each wall was lined with alcoves, and in each alcove a jar. Dozens, maybe hundreds. All corked, all sealed with wax. All labeled in a careful, lubing hand. Augustine Bro, laughter left side only. Colette Morin to grief, age 9. Jean-Luc Moreau, dream of the sea. Memories. Distilled. Collected. Stored. Not just bones. I chose one at random. Pried the wax seal loose and opened it. The smell hit me instantly. Warm wood. Ocean wind. Something citrus. And so faint I almost missed it, the sound of a child calling for their mother. The jar was breathing. I resealed it, hand shaking. What I didn't realize then was that I was no longer alone in the room. The walls began to pulse. Not visually, audibly. The sound of lungs expanding around me, slow and deliberate. The stone groaned, and from the far alcove, a shape detached itself from the dark. It was a woman, barefoot, dressed in a hospital gown, face waxen, as if carved from tallow. Her eyes were milk white, her mouth stitched shut, but she smiled at me. Her skin moved as if smoke ran beneath it. I stepped back, nearly tripping over one of the slabs. Then she spoke without speaking. The air around her vibrated, and her voice entered me not through my ears, but through my breath. You came to remember. I couldn't respond. You came to forget. She reached out. Her fingers were long, sooty, nails cracked and yellowed. When she touched my chest, I felt it. Memories I had buried rose up. My mother's funeral. My childhood dog's final breath. A hospital waiting room in 2012. A scream I once ignored in a parking garage. She fed on it all. Not to consume. Not to erase. To preserve. Then she whispered again. Each forgetting grows her stronger. Every untold story fills her with hunger. But memory? Memory burns slow. The room changed. Suddenly, I was no longer in the crypt. I stood in a sunlit hospital hallway. But it was wrong, too clean. Too bright. The scent of bleach suffocating. Patients walked the halls. Doctors nodded. But no one made a sound, because they had no mouths. I turned and saw Amelia, older, gaunt, her hair now white, eyes sunken. She looked at me with exhaustion and pity. Are you her now? I asked. She shook her head. She is me, she said, and I am memory. That's what she's always been. Not a monster, not a god. Just recollection, shaped by the breath of the dying. Then she pointed toward a patient's room. Inside, Mabel Morin lay in a bed, still alive. Barely. Oulé stood beside her, face blank, hands folded, and between them, standing sentinel, the lady. Her body was composed of vapors and bone. Her hair, a canopy of soot. In her chest, lungs that didn't breathe, but burned. Oulé turned to me and said, "We only wanted to preserve the ones they threw away. We gave them a second death. A warm death." Mabel added, "The body fails. The mind fades. But a breath caught in smoke, that lasts forever." Then all three turned and looked at me, and I woke, back in the crypt. Alone, but not quite. The jars had changed. Their labels now included names I recognized. Some who had died, others who were still very much alive.
And one labeled,
You. This visit. I left St. Regine that night. When I reached the car, the engine wouldn't start. But that didn't matter. I walked 50 miles back to the highway. Not a single gull flew overhead the entire time. And now, weeks later, I find myself unable to sleep. I dream of jars, of smoke coiled in lungs, of rooms that remember how the people inside died. I tried to reach Verlo. No answer. Tried to find Amelia. No trace. But the church is still there. The still house. And I believe, no, I know, that people still go there. Not to pray. To preserve. To offer their breath, their memory, their grief, to something that does not judge. Something that only asks, what shall I keep for you? And if you don't answer, she'll choose for you. A room that smelled like teeth. There are houses that never rot, not because they're built well, or because someone maintains them, but because something inside them refuses to let them decay. They hold memory the way a body holds trauma. Years of hurt woven into the beams. Grief soaked into the drywall like nicotine. These houses don't age. They fester. I found one such house 2 days after leaving St. Regine. It was a nurse who gave me the address. She worked at a psychiatric recovery facility in Alexandria. Said she once treated a woman named Sister Ulay, though the woman had no file, no diagnosis, no family name. Only that first name, Ulay, and a disturbing talent. She remembered everything. Every patient's confession. Every word she'd ever heard. Even the dreams of the sedated. When the nurse asked where she came from, Ulay whispered, from a room that smelled like teeth. And then she'd cry. Without tears. Just soft sobs and whispers of burning lungs. The address she left behind, scrawled into a hymnal in the facility chapel, wasn't a full one. Just Oak Hollow Road, where the fence ends. Look for the dead garden. No city. No state. Just that. But Louisiana isn't kind to secrets. Even old ones have a way of rising when the bayous swell. I found Oak Hollow outside of Marksville. A cracked ribbon of road snaking through cypress and rot. The fence at its end was broken in 3 places, and beyond it, a house that should have collapsed years ago. I knew instantly I was in the right place. No birds. No wind. No insects. Just heat and quiet. The smell of copper and cloves. A dry, sugary smell that hung in the air like a migraine. And the soil in the front garden, dead, gray, and blistered, was dotted with teeth. Not animal. Human. The house didn't creak when I stepped inside. It exhaled. Dust coated everything except the hallway leading to the basement door, as if footsteps had been walking it regularly, though no footprints showed. Only a line in the dust, as if something had been dragged. I followed it. The basement door was made of dark wood, carved with hundreds of tiny faces. Some screaming, some whispering, one laughing, but with too many teeth. It wasn't locked. The stairs descended into a soft glow. Candles. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. All flickering behind jars filled with murky fluid. And suspended in each jar, teeth. Not just whole ones, but fragments too. Slivers of molars. Incisors cracked in half. Roots intact. Some blackened. Some still pink with pulp. And on the walls, writing. Memory begins in the mouth. The tooth holds the final breath. Smoke cannot lie. In the center of the room, in a wooden chair that faced no altar, no icon, just the wall, sat a woman. She looked almost asleep. Head tilted. Eyes open, but glassy. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her dress was a hospital gown yellowed with age. It was Ulay, or what was left of her. Her chest rose, shallowly. but she didn't breathe air. I watched as a thin stream of smoke leaked from her nose, twisting upward, forming delicate shapes in the candlelight, then fading. She was alive, but only barely. Kept that way, I realized, by something else. In the far corner of the room stood a small black furnace. Unlike the stone kiln beneath the stillhouse in St. Regine, this one was modern, industrial, but it wasn't plugged in. No gas line. No power. Still, it burned. Inside it, something writhed. I couldn't see it directly, but the shadows it cast on the wall danced wrongly, as if they moved in reverse, as if they weren't just shadows, but echoes. And every few minutes, Ule would twitch, slightly, and the smoke would thin. The furnace was feeding on her. I don't know what compelled me to approach, but I did. As I got closer, the furnace began to whisper, not with words, but with memories. Not mine. Others. A woman laughing while burying a box in the yard. A child sobbing beneath a staircase, clutching a dog collar. A priest standing in a flooded chapel, mouthing a prayer with no voice. I saw these things in flashes, like dreams half remembered. Then the furnace noticed me. It went quiet. And then it spoke. You have carried many. I couldn't move. So many forgotten things. So much rot in the corners of your mind. The air grew heavy. My ears popped. I tasted blood. Then, Ule gasped. Loud. Sudden. Her back arched, and she screamed, not from her throat, but from her teeth. A high-pitched keening that cracked the candlelight and sent several jars tumbling. And the furnace screamed back. Smoke poured from its mouth, forming a shape, a woman made of cinders and steam. It was her. The lady. The same from the stillhouse. But this time, she was smaller. Weaker, strained. I understood then. Ule was her anchor. Her last tether to this world. And the furnace. A heart. A synthetic one made by desperate hands, trying to keep something divine from dying completely. The lady looked at me, but this time she did not smile. She was afraid. It's coming undone, she said. You're seeing too much. Hearing what shouldn't be heard. I tried to speak, but the words burned. She stepped toward me, and for a moment, I smelled my father's cologne. Then my grandmother's voice calling my name. Then the sharp, clean scent of anesthesia before my appendix surgery. She was reaching inside me, trying to find a memory she could take. Something strong, something rooted. But I pushed back. I held one thought, one image, a photo. The cremated remains of 37 unnamed patients from Riverside Sanatorium, marked unclaimed. I had it in my files. I kept that image at the front of my mind. And the lady screamed. Not from pain, from recognition. Because they weren't unclaimed. They had been taken, preserved, not by family, but by her, as offerings. Their final memories burned into smoke and stored. Ule collapsed. The furnace flared once, then died, and the lady with it. Gone. Only ash remained. I called emergency services, but when they arrived, there was no basement, no furnace, no jars, only an empty room that smelled like formaldehyde and rusted iron. Ule was gone. The entire house burned to the ground 3 hours later. They called it an electrical fire despite the fact there were no wires. I don't believe that was the end of her. Not truly. You don't erase something like that. You disperse it. And I think that's what happened. She's in the air now. Not strong. Not full. But present. In whispers behind hospital curtains. In dreams that smell like old wood and blood. In the way certain empty rooms feel watched. All that memory, all that smoke, it had to go somewhere. I haven't slept in 3 days. Every time I try, I wake up gagging. Not on breath. On ash. The swamp's whispering hunger. The sun was a fading ember behind the cypress canopy, but the swamp did not soften. It grew colder and darker, the very air thickening with a damp, oppressive weight that seemed to seep into the bones of anyone who dared enter. In this shadowed realm, where twisted roots sank deep and the water lapped with a slow, hungry cadence, the sisters' secret was beginning to unravel, pulled taut by the relentless curiosity of the few who refused to forget what the bayou had buried. Even after all these months, after all the whispered warnings and the hurried prayers, the land itself seemed alive with a sinister memory. The sisters, once a quiet part of the local folklore, polite, charming, the kind of women who invited you in with soft smiles and sweet tea, had become specters haunting the edges of every murmur, every flickering lantern in the night. What was once a mere tale of warning had evolved into a dark legend, a living nightmare written in blood and flesh beneath the moss-draped branches. It began with the disappearance of a young hunter named Emil, who had ventured too deep into the swamp one late afternoon. His friends swore they heard his cries in the distance, harsh and ragged. But when they followed, all they found was silence and the faintest scent of something iron-rich and rotting, carried on the stagnant breeze. No trace of Emil ever surfaced, except, as rumor insisted, for the glint of his shattered knife caught among the roots near the old cabin, long since abandoned but never forgotten. That cabin was the sisters' sanctuary, or rather, what was left of it after the rumors seeped through the bayou like oil. When search parties cautiously approached, their movements met with eerie stillness, an unnatural hush that made even the most seasoned trackers pause. It was as if the swamp itself was holding its breath, watching, waiting. Those brave or foolish enough to linger near the cabin spoke of strange sounds, soft murmurs woven into the sighing wind, a low, wet scraping that seemed too deliberate to be the swamp's own song. And then there were the eyes. Not one set, but many, reflecting faintly from the darkness, glinting amber, cold and calculating, watching from just beyond the veil of Spanish moss. They whispered of a hunger that could not be sated by fish or game, but demanded a far darker feast. The sisters were said to move with an unnatural grace, their footsteps soundless on the mossy earth. They never spoke loudly, only in soft tones that the swamp seemed to carry farther than it should. Stories from old-timers hinted at rituals, strange gatherings by the blackened waters under the sickle moon, where words were spoken in tongues long forgotten and offerings left in shallow graves. The smell of burnt herbs and something far fouler, decay, death, lingered in the air, a mark left by those who had witnessed too much and lived to tell a broken tale. In the town nearby, the atmosphere was thick with fear and denial. Mothers held their children close, whispering warnings to never stray near the swamp's edge. Yet, the pull of the unknown was stronger than the dread for some. Young men would disappear without a trace, swallowed by the ever-shifting shadows. Some came back, but hollow-eyed and mute, their sanity eroded like the crumbling levees beneath the relentless water. A small group of men, driven by desperation and a need for answers, decided to confront the sisters. They believed that the tales were exaggerated, that fear had twisted reality into a monstrous caricature. Armed with rifles, knives, and stubborn resolve, they ventured into the bayou, their lanterns slicing feeble beams into the encroaching darkness. Each step felt heavier, the swamp seeming to resist their intrusion, clutching at their ankles with muddy fingers. When they found the cabin, it was worse than they imagined. The wooden walls were blackened and scarred as if fire had licked them, but never fully consumed the place. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of rot and something coppery, the unmistakable scent of blood. Bones, small and large, littered the floor, some gnawed and broken, others arranged with an eerie care, as if placed for some grim ceremony. Then came the discovery that chilled them to their core. An altar carved from swamp wood, decorated with feathers, teeth, and what appeared to be shards of human bone. Flickering candles cast grotesque shadows on the walls, illuminating crude symbols etched deep into the wood, marks that no one dared to identify, for fear of summoning what they represented. The men called out for the sisters, their voices echoing hollowly. But only silence answered, save for the wet, rasping sound that seemed to crawl from the depths of the swamp itself. Panic set in as figures emerged from the gloom. 2 women, their faces pale and sharp, eyes dark pools, reflecting cold, cruel intelligence. Their smiles were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the terror they inspired. The confrontation was swift and brutal. The sisters moved with unnatural speed and strength, their nails sharpened like claws, their teeth bared in grim anticipation. The men fought desperately, but the swamp was their ally, and it claimed them one by one. When dawn finally broke, only silence remained where screams had once rung out. The town mourned the lost men, but knew better than to seek answers in the bayou. The sisters' legend had been confirmed, no longer a whisper, but a roaring truth. People spoke in hushed tones of the sisters' unnatural bond to the swamp, a pact sealed with dark forces that fed on the living. The swamp was more than just land, soaked with water and decay. It was a living, breathing entity that demanded sacrifice, and the sisters were its chosen keepers. Over time, strange things began to appear near the swamp's edges. Livestock found mutilated beyond recognition, their bodies twisted as if by invisible hands. Children spoke of seeing 2 pale figures watching from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly like embers. Some whispered that the sisters could not die, that they were bound to the swamp's hunger for eternity, cursed to walk between worlds, neither fully alive nor dead, feeding endlessly on the despair and flesh of those foolish enough to cross their path. A local healer, old and wise, warned that the sisters were once human, twisted by grief and madness, but had since become something else, monsters born from the bayou's darkest corners. She spoke of a ritual, long lost, that might sever the sisters' tie to the swamp and release the trapped souls beneath its surface. But the cost was said to be terrible, requiring a sacrifice greater than any the swamp had yet demanded. Now, as the swamp's whispers grow louder and the night deepens, the question remains, who will answer its call? Who will step into the darkness, facing the sisters' hunger and the swamp's ancient curse? For the swamp is patient, and its appetite endless. Those who listen closely may hear it still, the faint, wet sound of flesh being torn, the slow, deliberate breathing of something that should not exist. In the heart of the bayou, beneath the twisted cypress trees and the veil of Spanish moss, the sisters wait. Their hunger is eternal, their story far from over. The last offering to the bayou. The swamp had claimed many lives, and yet it whispered still, a low, constant murmur beneath the thick blanket of moss and mist. The sisters, once gentle and kind in the light of day, had become legends of terror, immortalized not by their names, but by the hunger that gnawed at the edges of the bayou's soul. In the deep dark, where no man dared linger, the final chapter was being written, one soaked in blood and silence. The old healer's warning had been taken up by a desperate few, those who refused to let fear keep them chained to ignorance. They spoke in hushed tones about the ancient ritual, a long-forgotten rite of severance meant to free the restless souls trapped beneath the swamp's surface. It required courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to step beyond the veil of life and death itself. Among those willing was a young woman named Elise, whose family had suffered more than their share of loss. Her brother, like so many others, had vanished into the shadows, swallowed whole by the bayou's insatiable appetite. She carried the weight of grief, but also the fierce determination to end the sisters' reign of terror. Armed with the healer's fragmented instructions and a heart steeled by sorrow, Elise ventured into the swamp at dusk, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. As she moved deeper, the familiar sounds of the bayou faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed unnatural. The cypress trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches heavy with moss that brushed like cold fingers against her skin. Elise could feel the eyes, countless, unseen, watching her every step. The whispers began, barely audible at first, swirling around her like a chill wind, growing louder with each heartbeat. She reached the altar carved from swamp wood, now covered in twisting vines and faded symbols. Here, the boundary between worlds was thin, and Elise knew what she must do. The ritual called for a sacrifice, not a life taken in violence, but a willing offering of one's own blood to the earth, a binding of spirit and flesh to break the sister's curse. With trembling hands, Elise drew a small knife, its blade catching the last rays of dying sunlight. She pressed it to her palm, letting the crimson drip slowly onto the altar. The swamp seemed to hold its breath as the blood soaked into the wood, seeping deep into the dark soil beneath. Then came the voices, soft at first, then rising into a chorus of sorrow and rage. The sisters appeared from the shadows, their faces pale and sharp, eyes blazing with a cold fire. They circled the altar, their movements both graceful and terrifying, their whispers weaving a chant older than memory. Elise felt the swamp stir beneath her feet, the water rising slowly like a tide summoned by unseen hands. The air grew thick with the scent of rot and smoke, and the veil between worlds began to tear. From the depths emerged the shapes of the lost, ghostly figures of those devoured, their eyes hollow, mouths agape in silent screams. The sisters' chant reached a crescendo, and Elise, despite the fear clawing at her heart, held steady. She called upon the old healer's words, binding her spirit to the earth, offering herself as the key to undoing the curse. For a moment, the swamp was still, a breath held in the dark. Then, with a sound like the cracking of ancient bones, the sisters screamed, an unearthly, piercing wail that echoed through the trees and shook the very ground. Their forms twisted, contorted, and began to dissolve into mist, swallowed by the swamp they had once ruled. The ghostly figures of the lost floated upward, their faces softening, freed from torment. One by one, they vanished into the night sky, leaving only the whisper of a breeze and the faint scent of jasmine. Elise collapsed, her bloodied hands pressed to the altar. The swamp's hunger had been stilled, the sister's curse broken, at a terrible cost. She had become part of the Bayou's eternal cycle, an offering that would ensure others could live free of the sister's shadow. The town awoke to a new dawn, the air lighter, the darkness receding. But the swamp, ancient and patient, waited still. It held its secrets beneath the water, in the twisting roots and the moss-draped branches, reminding all who dared listen that some stories never truly end. They only lie in wait. The sisters were gone, but the hunger remained. The Bayou's whispering hunger would return one day, and when it did, it would be hungry once more.